Chapter 30 Darcon. There was little light in the cold storage room, but the one lamp that sputtered overhead was enough to reveal just how dismal the place was. Chilled by the mountain stone and packed with snow and ice, it was cold enough there that their breath formed clouds. Pig carcasses hung from the ceiling and barrels of unknown foodstuffs filled the small room, which was the closest thing to a prison the temple had. I don't belong here. The thought ricocheted through Darcon's head, around and around, marred with disgust and confusion, as he flexed his hands in an effort to keep them warm. They didn't belong to him, with their short fingers and thick, calloused skin. His legs, once long and lean, were now short and stocky, his midsection thick and squat. The objects surrounding him seemed bigger, somehow taller, like he was looking through a disordered window, seeing them with someone else's eyes. Dwarven eyes. He had been transformed into a dwarf. He didn't know how he'd ended up here, and he didn't know why he now found himself in this body, but one thing was crystal clear. The man next to him was responsible. Seth, Leth, Revi, whatever the forsaken hells his name was sitting in the corner of the room, shivering, his hands shackled with spell locks to keep him from using magic. Darcon hadn't received the same treatment, but that did nothing to quell his frustration, or his panic. "This is wrong," he said, as much to himself as to his companion, as he continued his feverish pacing. "This is wrong. This is so wrong." With a yell, he hit the wall in frustration, sending a burst of pain through his knuckles. "You did this to me," he growled, rounding on Seth. "That's the only explanation. You couldn't stop after ruining my life. You had to curse me too." His lips pulled back in a snarl. "Were you trying to get me locked up in my own temple? Was that it?" Seth grunted, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Like I told you when you first woke up," he replied in monotone, "I didn't do this. Your brother performed a ritual to reincarnate you. It went wrong, you came back differently, and now you change bodies every morning. Now, for the love of all gods, shut the hells up. You've been at this all morning, and I'm sick of listening to it." With a growl of frustration, Darcon resumed his frantic movements, wrapping his arms around himself for warmth. He was tempted to start pounding on the door again, but it was clear no one from the Order would be visiting them any time soon. "You can't even be bothered to own up to it," he spat, turning back to Seth. "Of course you'd throw Brig on to the wolves. Why wouldn't you? It's not like you give a damn about anyone but yourself." The altercation in the tavern burned fresh in his mind. "I just want to know how you did it. This is high-level magic. Even I know that." Seth was silent. "Was it a curse? A hex?" Darcon clenched his hands into fists. "The least you could do is tell me how to get my memories and my body back." He insisted, infuriated. "You owe me that much." "For the 13th time today," Seth snapped. "You have to pray to Celestriona at night if you want your memories back. That's the only way." Darcon snorted. "Right." "I don't know what else to tell you," the thief replied, rubbing his dark eyes. He had been asleep when Darcon had awoken from deep darkness, only to find himself locked in the meat cellar, and the young initiate had no plans to let him drift back off. If he had to suffer through this confusion and fear, then so did the man who had done this to him. "You believed me yesterday when you came back as a Tegwin," the thaumaturge went on. "Did turning into a dwarf make you stupid as well as stubborn?" You're just going to have to believe me now," Seth told him flatly. He leaned back against the wall, his eyes drifting closed. "Or not. Your choice. As for your new body, don't worry. Tomorrow morning, it'll be something else." Seething, Darcon looked away, unable to stand it any longer. The only thing worse than being trapped in this new form was being trapped in it alongside the person at fault. If he could only make his case to the elders, it would be a simple matter of letting him out and turning Seth over to the conjury, where he belonged. The cold continued to press in on them, and silence joined it. Minutes passed, hours. Darcon's anger simmered, but he eventually quit pacing and slid to the floor, curling up against the wall as far away from Seth as he could manage. Finally, the heavy oak door scraped open, allowing a puff of warm air to drift into the room. Darcon, who had been sitting stone still, staring at nothing, looked up at the noise, and when he saw who had arrived, he surged to his feet. Nagus stood in the doorway. Master Disciple! He nearly tripped over himself as he rushed over to his mentor. It's me, Darcon! I know, his mentor replied, his expression pinched. Darcon could have wept in relief. He recognizes me. Thank the starry skies! You have to get me out of here. I don't suppose the dragon changed her mind, Seth said glibly, ignoring him. The older disciple shook his head, not pulling his eyes from Darcon. I'm afraid not, he replied, and there was a dismaying resignation in his voice. I'm here to tell you that the Conjurer representatives will be coming to speak with you both shortly. I've been trying to keep them away for Darcon's sake. They're doing nothing but damage as far as I'm concerned, but unfortunately, my voice doesn't hold much sway. Conjurer? A dragon? Darcon glanced from Seth to his mentor, unease gripping him. What are you talking about? What's this about the Conjurer? I've done nothing wrong. Darcon, Nagus began. But Darcon wasn't listening, too desperate to do anything but seize this chance to say his piece. I don't know what's happened, he nodded in Seth's direction. This man has done something to me, spelled me, enchanted me, whatever you want to call it. It's his fault. He got me stabbed on the road, and now I'm... He gestured hopelessly down at himself. Like this. Please, he added, his panic at his mentor's lack of reaction growing. You have to help me. I don't remember anything except being attacked. How did I end up here? Where's Bray gone? The master disciple blinked, his expression at once surprised and unsurprised. So it's true, then, he mused. You really do lose your memories come dawn. Darcon's throat grew thick. No. Why does no one ever believe me? Seth demanded. The older man didn't respond, stepping forward to get a better look at his pupil. His brow furrowed, the corners of his mouth pulling down as if he had never seen Darcon before in his life. By the gods, he murmured, to transform so completely every morning. I've never seen anything like it. Why are you saying that? Darcon demanded, flinching back. Master Disciple, why am I locked up in here? The truth was rearing its ugly head, but he shied away from it. What's wrong with me? I wish I knew, his mentor replied, and the resignation in his voice spoke volumes. Darcon seized Naga's wrist, aware of the way the man flinched in response. Please, he rasped, glancing in Seth's direction. He said the elders decided to send me away, but he's nothing but a con man. A liar, isn't he? He searched his mentor's eyes, his ever-present frustration boiling over. Isn't he? Seth is right, Nagus replied after an interminable moment. Your stories matched up when you arrived, down to the smallest detail. Even Lunar agreed. Darcon sucked in a breath, his hand dropping to his side. Lunar? She was here? She was. Nagus straightened up. You spoke with her. She was the one to decide your fate. He cleared his throat. She determined that you will never be able to complete your training here. No. Darcon shook his head and ground his fist into his palm. His voice rose nearly to a yell. That's not fair. I've done everything that was asked of me. I was trying to get my anger under control. I would still have my constellation scroll right now if this son of a whore hadn't taken it. He spat in Seth's direction. They can't just kick me out like this. Nagus shook his head, sighing. I'm sorry, Darcon. I wish I could change it. If I had the authority, you know I would. You were the best fighter I ever trained. I truly believe you would have ascended someday. There has to be another way. That was when a new voice, brisk and professional, emitted from the out in the hall. There is none. Darcon turned to see a red-headed dwarf dressed in conjuring vestments standing in the doorway. Behind her stood a gangly, dark-haired man who also wore the violet uniform of the organization. I sincerely hope you are letting the detained sweet-talk you, Master Disciple. The dwarven woman continued coolly, turning to Nagus. That would reflect poorly on your organization. Darcon's hackles went up. Detainee. like he was nothing more than some common cup-purse. Master-disciple Nagus cleared his throat. Apologies, Haro. I was just saying goodbye to a former apprentice. You wouldn't deny a clergy member that right, would you? The redhead, Haro, crossed her arms, but her expression softened. Of course not, she replied. Forgive me. She gestured between the pair of them, as if expecting them to hug. But please be quick. We have work to do here before we depart. Depart? Darkon's stomach lurched. Depart for where? The investigators' faces gave no answers. Nagus, he protested, turning to his mentor. Please. Nagus placed a hand on his shoulder. I am truly sorry, Darcon, he said, giving his student a bow that reeked of finality. Sparing one last glance over his shoulder at Darcon, he brushed past the others without another word and vanished into the hallway. Darkon's knees buckled under an invisible weight, his hand flying to a nearby barrel in an attempt to steady himself. Was this what it felt like to have the rug pulled out from underneath you? As far as he was concerned, the sellsword had plunged his blade into his back just hours ago. How could everything have gone so wrong? Even on these sturdy dwarven legs, he couldn't stay standing amidst the intensity of his devastation. Ears ringing, he dropped to the ground, pulling his legs to his chest like a frightened child. The investigators observed him from the doorway for a moment, before the tall man slipped past Haro and glided into the chill room. Cold in here, he observed. You must feel like you are, figuratively speaking, freezing your asses off. We're fine, Seth replied from where he sat, absurdly calm given the situation. He used the edge of the massive clamshell manacles that were pinning his hands together to rub his neck, right where a series of nasty-looking scars disappeared under his collar. The man looked as if he were going to say more, but Haro coughed into her hand and he fell silent. She entered the room, stifling a shiver as she came to a stop beside her companion. You'd think I'd love a good chilly mountain, but gods, give me a warm beach or a sunny glade over this any day. She offered them a smile. Darcon didn't return it. Why are you even here? Seth pressed, still eyeing the lanky man. You learned all there is to know last night at the meeting. Perhaps, Haro replied, but perhaps not. There is more to our assessment than simple testimony. Other factors must be taken into account. It's our responsibility to determine the best place for Darcon to be sent when we leave, given his situation. She crossed her arms. You can always chime in if you have something constructive to add, but honestly, you should probably just let us do our work. By the stars, she was talking about him like he was an ill-behaved toddler. He is sitting right here, Darcon growled, and he wants to know what the hells you want from him. The anger was of little comfort, but it was enough to drown out the sorrow welling within him. He grasped at it and held on for dear life. Of course you do, Haro replied indulgently. I imagine you're a smart boy. You'll better understand what we want from you when you hear our questions. Don't make anything up, Seth warned him. They're going to want honesty. Don't give me any damned advice. Darcon nearly snarled at him. That's my decision. Haro didn't bat an eye. Believe me, she replied. Everyone is honest with Viet. Her words were appropriately ominous. Swallowing his fear, Darcon turned his attention to the tall man, who strode silently forward. For a moment, he just stared down at him, his dark gaze piercing and shrewd. Darcon glared back, his mouth twisting in a definite sneer. I don't know what answers you could possibly want, he snapped. I don't know a damned thing. We'll see, was all Viet said in reply, as he sat down in front of him, crossing his legs and settling his hands in his lap. Darcon's eyes drifted to the man's collar, where a unique sigil was embroidered into the cloth. It was the stylized and looped double C of the Cascade Corp. The man was not just a normal conjuring investigator. His agitation, and now his nerves, building, Darcon glanced at the open doorway. Haro stood between him and the exit, a double-headed axe slung over her shoulder, and Celestriona only knew how many temple guards were waiting just beyond. He's telling the truth, Seth spoke up. You know this already. He can't remember anything from after his first death. You have to wait until tonight, when he can pray for them again. I'd prefer to hear that from the source, Viet replied, not even looking Seth's way. Memories are a curious thing, so easily forgotten when it suits us. Are you calling me a liar? Darcon demanded, pressing back against the wall. He suddenly felt like a caged animal, teeth bared and tail between his legs. Hardly, Viet replied, a practiced smile stretching across his pale, mustached face. It was uncanny, and it did nothing to quell Darcon's anxiety. You would be surprised at the things people remember, he continued, under the right circumstances, with the right leverage. His smile grew, his voice as cold and thin as the air around them. Now, young man, he continued, businesslike, as he clapped his hands against his knees, I need you to tell me the truth. I know you can do that for me. Let's start with the basics. How did you meet Seth? Darcon was ready to stay silent, and damn the son of a bitch for thinking he could make him talk. But he couldn't. He literally physically couldn't. Something had happened when Viet spoke the question. His voice changed, carrying in it tones that were downright inhuman, commanding, and profoundly unsettling all at the same time. It wasn't a matter of pitch or intonation, but of quality, as if someone else had said those last few words through the investigator's mouth. They wormed their way past Darcon's ears and into his skull, poking and prodding at the gray matter, there like cold fingers. It was ghastly, creeping down his back and making him shiver like nails on a chalkboard. He tried to shake his head, to make his mouth form the words to tell Viet off, but they didn't come. The grip on his mind intensified, wringing the response out like water from a towel. I received a letter, he replied, his voice stilted and halting. Seth was the one who delivered it. Thank you, Viet said, his voice returning to normal, only to take on that otherworldly quality again when he asked his next question. Who was the letter from? Darcon thrashed against the hand in his mind, floundering, his mouth twisting into all kinds of unnatural shapes, and his face heating up. Beads of sweat formed on his temples, even in the freezing cold. For a moment, he felt sure he would explode from the effort of resisting. Seth watched, looking both horrified and mesmerized, while Haro stared straight ahead, stone-faced. All the while, Viet just sat there, his expression hauntingly calm. Another second passed before it became too much. It was from Bragon, Darcon finally spat, the words pried from his lips. But I think Seth put a magic trap on it that knocked me out. Viet nodded slowly. Darcon was again granted momentary respite until the fingers dug in once more when the investigator said, Now, what happened to trap you in this cycle of reincarnation? Details, please. Darcon glanced around frantically, thrashing against a set of invisible restraints. His mouth opened and closed, a croak escaping his throat, and he was vaguely aware of Seth stiffening in the corner. I don't know how it happened, Darcon answered through gritted teeth. If it happened, for all I know, this is just some magical trick Seth is playing on me. He's done nothing but make things worse for me ever since he got here. Viet glanced over his shoulder at Haro, his eyebrows shooting up before returning his attention to Darcon. Are you lying to me? The pressure on his mind intensified, reaching a fever pitch that was physically painful. Crying out, Darcon clapped his hands over his ears. No, he protested, shrinking back. I'm not. I don't know what happened. I don't know why I'm in this body, and I don't know what you want from me. He looked at Seth through watering eyes. The last thing I remember is getting stabbed after the snake set some goons on me. He slid further towards the floor, sure that his mind was turning to mush under Viet's forceful pressure. He says I'm reborn in a new body every morning. Master Disciple Nagus agreed with him. That's all I know. Viet stared him down, for another agonizing moment, and then finally, the hand in his head retracted. This time, there was no follow-up question, and Darcon was left to hug himself, gasping for breath as he regained his mind. "Like I said," Seth interjected from where he sat, "you're not going to get anything out of him until Doc." "Please don't interfere," Harrow said without sparing Seth a glance. Her eyes were fixed on the former initiate. "Darcon, I strongly suggest you get a hold of yourself." Even through his suffering, Darcon scrambled upright, his shoulders tensing. The Order had thrown him out. His own mentor had turned his back on him. His memories were gone and his body was cursed. His rage flared, and all his efforts to control it had gone by the wayside a long time ago. They could take everything else from him, but they couldn't take that. "Get a hold of myself?" he spat, still catching his breath. "I didn't choose any of this. What in the starry skies do you want from me, huh? What are you doing to me? You've got some nerve to say that to me now, you bow-legged bitch." From off to his left, Seth barked a laugh. "Whether you believe us or not," Harrow replied, "we're trying to help you. Mind your rage before you burn through all of our good favor." Darcon scoffed. "This is your good favor?" he fired back, gesturing around. "I'm already stuck in this God's-forsaken cellar with the man who wanted me dead, and succeeded apparently. Forgive me for not kissing the ground you walk on." He struggled to his feet, still trembling from the trauma of Viet's questioning. If he was to be subjugated any more, it would be standing. "You want to haul me off to some prison somewhere? Throw me into some conjuring institute so you can study me? Fine. Do it and stop wasting my time." Viet stood up. "I've heard enough," he said. "Indeed," Harrow replied, shaking her head. "It's a shame. Truly it is." Turning back to the former initiate, she went on. "If that's what you want, Darcon, that's what you'll get. But it won't be a mainland prison, or any one of our lyceums. You'll be going somewhere else entirely." "Wait a minute," Seth interjected, alarmed as he got up. "None of this was his fault. You can't just send him there." "Send me where?" Darcon demanded. "We can," Harrow replied, "and we will." She looked sadly at Darcon. "We were hoping to evaluate you here, to see if you might be a candidate for recruitment. Immortality is no small thing. But it looks like we were mistaken." She sighed. "You're in no state to be representing the Conjury. Maybe a few years on the island will straighten you out." She shrugged her shoulders, her eyes darting briefly down to her legs. "Then again, maybe not." Terror seized Darcon, and this time, not even anger was enough to keep it at bay. "Tide Island?" Harrow nodded. "You're too much of a liability as you are now. The Conjurer will reevaluate you once your abilities, and your temperament, have settled." "That's going to kill him," Seth objected. "That would be unfortunate," the copper-haired dwarf replied, "but it's a risk we'll have to take. Power is a privilege, and giving the vestments to someone with that much anger brings a far greater risk." "No," Darcon said, lurching back. "No, you can't. I don't belong there." "You do realize what you're doing, don't you?" Seth protested, and there was genuine alarm behind his words. Since when did he care? Magic doesn't work on that island. If he dies while he's there, he won't come back. "Then he will be in the same position as all the others who are sent there," Harrow replied matter-of-factly. "Regardless, the decision is ours to make." "But this isn't your concern, Seth Darkstar," Harrow said, leveling him with a chilling stare. "You, however, are very much ours. We still have questions that need answering. We aren't ignorant to the fact that you yourself are also a magical anomaly." Seth stared her down, but didn't reply. For once, Darcon couldn't blame him. Not that it would matter in the end. "Viet," Harrow said, gesturing in his direction, "if you would." Her partner started forward, no doubt ready to turn that same abominable ability on the thaumaturge. Now, he said, rubbing his hands together, let's begin with where you... But Seth didn't let him finish, instead leaning forward and whispering something fast and quiet into the investigator's ear. Viet's brows furrowed as he listened, the corners of his mouth pulling down. Darcon frowned, straining to hear, but he couldn't catch what was said. He could only watch, first in confusion, and then in dismay, as Viet sighed, nodded, and then nodded again. After a long moment of listening, backed away from Seth. We're letting him go, he stated, and that was it. Haro blinked. Are you sure? Viet gave a slow nod, and something unspoken passed between the two investigators. Haro rubbed the back of her neck, clearly taken aback. Very well, she said at last. We will escort you out. Darcon shook his head, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. What the hells are you talking about? Best get some sleep while you can, Haro advised Darcon, taking Seth by the arm and ushering him to the door. We leave tonight. You're sending me to Tide Island? But you're setting him free? Darcon exclaimed, furious, fearful tears thickening his throat and stinging his eyes. After everything he's done, this is his fault. They didn't even have the decency to respond. They simply filed out of the cellar one at a time, leaving Darcon to stare after them. Just before the door swung shut, Seth looked over his shoulder, his gray eyes somber. I told you, kid, he said sadly. I'm never going back to Tide Island. With that, he turned away, his head bowed. You can't do this, Darcon screamed, but his cry fell on deaf ears. They closed the door behind them, sealing him in the cellar with a frosty wooden bang. Curses tumbled from his mouth as he wiped furiously at his cheeks. For a moment, he dared to pray they would change their minds. Then he heard the damning scrape of the latch sliding home, and he was left in frigid silence. Chapter 31. Mina. Light filtered through the gap at the bottom of Mina's blindfold, and a sweet breeze kissed her skin as it wafted into the courtyard. The low stone bench where she sat had been warmed by the sun, and the temple grounds were peaceful. In the trees dotting the lower slopes, the birds were singing their raucous song, and the day spoke of spring. But Mina found no enjoyment in any of it. Dryerweep has cast his gaze upon you, child. Lunar's words played on like a weaving shuttle, back and forth in her head, a source of constant torment. Although she knew she should be in bed, she didn't think she could sleep, as much as she wanted to. She felt like her life had been ripped asunder, unbound like a book with its pages torn from its cover. Lennox, who until that point had been pacing about the courtyard, at last voiced his thoughts. It's a farce, he said. The whole damnable thing. Mina shook her head. Lunar has the final word. There's no arguing that. Oh, believe me, I'm not, Lunax replied, resuming his pacing. It's the why that I can't figure out. Truly? Mina replied, turning in his direction. I can't stargaze any more, Master Disciple. I lost my place here the moment I lost my ability to see the sky. It couldn't have happened to someone less deserving, her mentor said. His adamance was wearing on her for reasons she couldn't pinpoint. You were doing so well, you didn't deserve this. I'm not sure that's true, Mina replied. My parents sent me here, but only so that I wouldn't starve. Lennox cleared his throat. I hadn't forgotten. Did you know that I didn't even know who Celestriona was until I arrived? She swung her legs absently. They weren't quite long enough to touch the ground. That deep connection everyone says they feel when they hear her voice? I've never felt it. She gestured weakly at their surroundings. What if all this is just my comeuppance for being here for the wrong reasons? Don't say that. You're the most steadfast student I've ever had. But it's the truth, she insisted. Maybe I never did belong here. Maybe Lunar saw that. Although she couldn't see him, she could sense Lennox's dismay, Worried she'd hurt his feelings, she changed the subject, fidgeting with her blindfold. "It's daytime," she said. "Has Darcon changed again?" "At dawn, just as that Seth fellow claimed he would," her mentor affirmed. "It's a curious thing." Mina's eyebrows shot up. "You saw it?" "Not the change itself, no," Lennox said. "But I spoke to the attendant who brought him and the thief breakfast. He witnessed the whole thing." He paused. "He's a dwarf today, apparently." "Ay, the gods," Mina breathed. Seeing him as a Tenguin had been hard enough to believe. Imagining him shorter than even her was borderline absurd. It was so far from everything she had once associated with him, like he was no longer the person who had left the Order weeks ago. "You're not the only one whose life had been upended," she reminded herself. "By the gods, indeed, all 80 of them," Lennox mused. "Dreadful. And there doesn't appear to be a pattern to the new bodies, either. It's completely unpredictable." "And they haven't figured out a cure for him?" Mina asked, setting aside her dismay in favor of concern for Darcon. She hadn't been allowed to speak with him after the meeting. He'd been carted straight downstairs like nothing more than a common prisoner. "Nothing they can use to help him?" "Only what he explained during his testimony," her instructor replied, sighing again. "The attendant did mention that it was about a minute and a half from when he slumped over in his cell to when he came to," he added. "He said Darcon was combative when he woke up, full of rage." New footsteps sounded in the courtyard then, and Lennox stopped speaking. "Investigators," he addressed the newcomers as the footsteps approached. "We weren't expecting the pleasure of your company." He didn't bother to mask the disdain in his voice. "Apologies for interrupting," came the cool reply. The voice was Haro's. "We were hoping to speak to your student." "What about?" Mina asked, weary that they were going to have her remove her blindfold again. "It's a matter of your future," Haro replied diplomatically. "Next steps, if you will, seeing as your order can no longer maintain you as an initiate." Lennox grunted. "I take it this is the part where you two tried to haul her off to study." He sniffed. "Or is it just indentured servitude these days? Tell me, do they pay you, or—" "No need for animosity," Viet replied softly. He didn't elaborate further. There was a pause as Haro moved over to the bench, sitting quietly down beside Mina, who tensed. "You have been given a rare gift, Mina," the dwarven woman said. "Gift is a relative term," the former initiate replied, her gaze still fixed straight ahead. The investigator cleared her throat. "Be that as it may," she continued, "it is unlike anything we've ever seen before." "I don't doubt it," Master Disciple Lennox snarked. "You attempt to joke," Viet addressed him, "but Haro speaks the truth. In the history of the conjurer, as far as I know, no one has ever successfully seen the future. Until now," Haro added. "Mina, your ability can be an invaluable asset to our organization's work." Mina turned to her in disbelief. You're offering me a job?" "With the conjurer, yes," Haro replied. "Magic is the root of Dragon Dresdel's economy. In the 43 years since our organization was created, we have done incredible things. Think of all the wars we've stopped by regulating the use of combat magic. Think of all the crime we've eradicated, all the accidents we've prevented. Our tariffs build cities, keep garrisons armed and staffed, fund universities, and finance trained healers." Mina swallowed, thinking back to Warwood's story. But she said nothing. "Yet someone needs to make sure those dues are being paid," Haro continued. "The rules are only as strong as those who enforce them. I understand that's an opinion you hold strongly, Mina." Mina pursed her lips. Haro must have deduced that she'd been the one who sent the babblebird. It wouldn't have been difficult to figure out after all. The creature would have kept repeating her desperate entreaty, its replication of her voice unmistakable, until it was given a new message to supersede the old one. "I don't know about that," Mina replied, hedging. I think it's important to follow the rules, I mean. Indeed, Aro agreed. Magic users who fail to go through the proper channels aren't contributing to our society's functioning. Just as importantly, they pose a great danger to themselves and to others. Your gift could help us make sure that doesn't happen. She shifted, closer to Mina. Who knows how much potential it holds? With the right nurturing, you might even be able to use it to prevent other incidents, like the one that occurred in the observatory. The courtyard fell silent as she finished her pitch, although Lennox was shuffling his feet, agitated. Mina cleared her throat. She hadn't been expecting this. In fact, she hadn't been expecting much of anything in the aftermath of Lunara's pronouncement. To have a ministry as far-reaching as the Conjurer offered to employ her was so much more than she could have hoped for. She wouldn't be tossed out on the streets. She wouldn't have to beg to survive. She would never have to worry about where her next meal would come from, the way she had back in the Civil Lands. She could find a new path forward. The urge to say yes was intense. But the word caught in her throat. Here she was, being offered a job on a silver platter, while her best friend languished in the cold cellar with the man who had ruined both of their lives. You make a compelling argument, she said at last. But I can't accept. Not until I know what will become of Darcon. Will he be coming with us? Haru hesitated for a moment, likely exchanging a glance with Viet. Darcon is troubled, the dwarf responded finally. We spoke with him earlier. He was nothing but confrontational and uncooperative. His anger is a liability. We can't offer him a position until he sorts through it. He's alone, Mina pointed out. He's afraid, and if what they said is true, he doesn't know what's happening to him. You're right, of course, Haru acknowledged, but that doesn't make him any less dangerous. He has to come to grips with what is happening to him before he can be given any sort of official responsibility, or freedom, for that matter. Wait, Mina said, alarmed. Freedom? You're not saying he'll remain a prisoner, are you? Mina, Haru replied, you need to understand what your friend is capable of. We can't relinquish custody of him knowing his potential. We can't set him free until he learns to get a handle on his emotions. So what are you going to do with him then? Mina asked, turning in Haru's direction. Now it was Haru's turn to clear her throat. Until he can learn to manage his temper, Darcon will be sent to Tide Island. Mina's mouth dropped open. Everyone from Emerald Reach to the Hasmond Gulf had heard the stories of Tide Island. What mage didn't freeze in terror at the prospect of being sent there? What parents in Dragon Drizzle hadn't used the threat of the place to keep misbehaving children in line? It was the stuff of nightmares, infested with horrors the likes of which she couldn't fathom. The prison itself housed the worst of humanity. Horrified, she sprang to her feet. You can't do that to him. Mina, Haru began, only to pause when a new voice filtered into the courtyard, carried through the open stone archway, leading out of the courtyard and into the training area. Mina knew that voice all too well. It belonged to the man who had done this to her, the thief whose strange magic had clashed with the power she summoned in the observatory, the power she had unknowingly drawn from Dryerweep himself. Seth Darkstar. And he was loose on temple grounds. Possible to hitch a ride with you, he was saying, his voice drawing nearer. Just the nearest town. I don't need to go far. She wasn't sure what possessed her to lift the blindfold, but she did anyway, just as the dark-haired man stepped into view beyond the archway. The other deputy who had accompanied the investigators, Kopa, was walking next to him. The vision that greeted her when she laid eyes on him made her stomach turn over. Unlike his companion, lanced to death by a dragon's tail, the Tide Islander's shadowy fate was one of far more suffering. His form, tall and muscular now, was reduced to a little more than a gnarled branch, gaunt and skeletal, curled up in the remains of some long, ruined building as he passed. Chaos raged all around him, and as did the others, the man's death appeared to be coming within 10 years. He starves to death, Mina thought, alarmed. But does that mean... She forced herself to look at the thief, Seth. He was a wreck, his face a battered mess. But it was him, all right. He was speaking to the deputy, neither bound nor under guard. Worse, there was a sword at his hip. The shadow image made her jerk on the spot, even though she had already seen it twice now. The same straight-horned celestial dragon, possibly big, standing behind Seth with its wings unfurled like a tapestry. Right on cue, it opened its massive jaws, unleashing a wave of entropy that wiped out everything else. "I doubt that'll be a problem," the enforcer was saying as they moved past the courtyard, replying to a question she hadn't heard. "We'll be taking the highway most of the way to Port Deebrook, so that shouldn't..." Mina couldn't swear to it, but she thought she caught a glimpse of Seth, the real Seth, the one behind the vision, turning to look in her direction, his haunted, stormy eyes meeting hers for a moment. Then he was disappearing beyond the archway, taking the premonition with him. She lowered her blindfold as they disappeared from earshot, just in time for Lennox to explode across from her. "What in the hells is that?" he demanded, rounding on the investigators. "What is he doing out of the cold cellar?" "He is no longer a prisoner," Viet said calmly. "Excuse me." "It's true," Harrow replied. "He's to be released." "Horseshit," Lennox spat, seething. "He's a criminal." "Master-disciple, don't patronize me. Lunar might not be letting us administer our own punishment, but if you think you can let that bastard go without any sort of recourse..." "This is really none of your concern, Master-disciple," Harrow replied briskly. "The conjury isn't part of your jurisdiction." Mina blinked, startled. "Conjury?" she asked, appalled. "He's one of you?" Harrow sighed, getting up from the bench. "Seth Darkstar is complicated," she explained. "He's not employed by the conjury, but he's under our protection. Our hands are tied." "According to who?" Lennox demanded. "As I said," Harrow responded, growing frosty, "this is none of your concern." "To hell's with that," Lennox growled back as he stalked back to the entrance. "I'm taking this up with the elders. This isn't over." "Believe me, it is," Viet stated. Lennox didn't reply, but a split second later, the door slammed shut with a rattling boom. If she'd known this would be the last time she ever saw him, she would have followed. But instead, she remained where she was, her mind reeling. Harrow sighed. "I'm sorry for that little scene," she said. "Your mentor is somewhat single-minded. At any rate, there's still the matter of your employment." "So that's it, then?" Mina asked, backing up, nearly stumbling over the bench as she went. "What about Darcon? What about Seth? You're just setting him free after everything he's done?" "As we explained to your instructor," Harrow replied patiently, like she was addressing a petulant child. "Seth is an unrelated issue. His release is unfortunate, but necessary." "No, that's..." Mina shook her head. "He can't just get to do that and walk away. It's not right." "I'm sorry, Mina," the investigator replied, "but there's nothing we can do." Mina shook her head again. She became aware that she was angry, her gut roiling as she fought to keep a hold on her emotions like she'd been taught, to put them away like the good little initiate she was. But she wasn't an initiate anymore. "He did this to me." She raised a hand to her eyes. "I can no longer see because of him. I can no longer train." "Mina, how many laws did he break when he did what he did?" She interrupted, her voice quivering with frustration. "How many of the rules you keep talking about, and you're letting him go, while sending Darcon to Tide Island? After all that talk about the proper channels and the dangers of unauthorized magic? Or does all of that only apply to the rest of us?" That touched a nerve. Harrow's voice changed. "This is a special case," she said, taking a step in Mina's direction. Mina scrambled over the bench in response, disgusted with herself for having been so taken in by their pitch. "You're a hypocrite," she hissed. "You both are. There is no need for that," Haro told her. "We've been nothing but courteous to you, and we would appreciate the same." "Just like you've been courteous to my friend," Mina shot back. The sensible part of her was telling her to shut up and apologize before she ruined everything. She didn't listen. The illusion had been broken, and there was no escaping back into it. "Careful now," the other woman cautioned. "Remember that you are still in the conjuree's custody." Mina balked, faltering. "You were never going to let me go then," she stated. "We were always going to be leaving with you," Haro replied, her tone maddeningly pragmatic. Though she was standing in the broad daylight, its warmth suffusing her, Mina suddenly felt as cold as when she had been speaking to Lunar. "In light of your magic," the dwarf continued, "we wanted to offer you an alternative to going with the prison transport. As was our original plan." Mina struggled to calm her breathing. "Just say yes," the voice in her head cried out. "Stop this before you say something you can't take back." She was going to. By the gods, she was going to. But then Haro spoke again, that patronizing air back and stronger than it had ever been. "That offer," she added, "can always be rescinded." "If you exile people like Darcon," Mina replied slowly, as if awakening from a deep sleep, "and you work with people like Seth, then you can forget it." She took a breath, leveling her blindfolded gaze in Haro's direction. "I'm not working for you." "Rejection would be unwise," Viet remarked. Haro sighed. "And here we were thinking you were someone who knew to follow the rules." Viet spoke in a monotone. "I guess we are mistaken." Mina swallowed. It was obvious they wanted her to agree. Their desire to use her for her visions might as well have been booming through the courtyard. "You can still come work for us," Haro pressed. "It's not too late." Feeling like she was going to explode, Mina wrapped her arms around herself and squeezed her eyes shut. They always said not to look a gift horse in the mouth, and here she was, doing exactly that. She had no doubt that her response would dictate everything that would happen next. Wouldn't it be smarter just to accept? She wasn't like Darcon. She couldn't throw caution to the wind and tell the higher-ups to screw themselves. Could she? What rules would I break if I had to? Chapter 32. Darcon. Meditation eluded him, as it always had, and time passed as slowly as the planets spun in the sky. With no windows, it was impossible to get a real sense of how long he had been down here. But then again, Darcon supposed it didn't matter. His destiny was sealed the moment those two conjuring investigators had walked into the cellar. Now, with only sacks of food and the occasional mouse for company, he was left to wallow, vacillating between anger, confusion, and surrender. He might have slept, but he couldn't be sure. All he really understood was that there would be no escape. Gods knew he'd tried, rummaging through the food stores and throwing his shoulder against the door until it was too painful to continue. Where was the stonebreaker spell when he needed it? It was clear there would be no forcing his way out. If only he had come back as an ogre, like Seth claimed he had before, he would have been able to knock the door straight off its hinges. Even if you could force your way out, what would you do? A voice in his head demanded. Where would you go? He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact he had to ask the question, or the fact he had no answer. When he left Breakmore as a boy, he had his family by his side. Now, he had nobody. Some terrified part of him refused to accept that any of this was happening, rebelling at the idea of his circumstances to such an extent that when he closed his eyes, he could almost forget where he was. Maybe, if he tried hard enough, he could make these memories disappear along with all the others. Darcon's eyes flew open when footsteps approached outside the door, and the accompanying rattle of the bar being pulled out made him straighten up. His belly turned to ice as he watched the door swing open, bracing himself for Viet, with his cunning eyes and his sinister silken voice. He almost couldn't believe it when instead he found himself face to face with Mina. She stood there in the doorway, rigid, tense, and uncertain, her eyes still covered with the strip she had donned before he departed the temple. He had never thought he would see her again. "Mina?" Darcon said quietly, his dwarven voice thick and alien to his ears. He could only wonder what she thought, seeing him like this. He was struck by the desire to spring to his feet and embrace her, to cling to her familiarity and her stability, but he forced himself to hold back in the face of sudden unease. Maybe she thought of him as the conjurer did, a tragic freak of nature, nothing more. Darcon. A small, barely perceptible smile appeared on Mina's face. I've missed you. The relief that smile brought was more intense than she could ever know. I've missed you too, Min, he replied, venturing to use her nickname from before, and her smile grew. He could sense relief in her, too, as if some unspoken question between them had finally been answered. It wasn't long, however, before the apprehension trickled back in. You're not supposed to be in here, Darcon said, his eyes drifting to the open doorway. Mina's smile faltered, and then died. I know, she hesitated, biting her lip, and he had time to wonder if she, too, would turn her back on him. Then she nodded, seemingly making a decision, and extended a hand to him. Come on, she said. Let's go. Darcon frowned. What are you talking about? I've come to get you out, Mina answered. For a moment, Darcon could only stare up at her, unable to believe he just heard his ever-dutiful friend say those words. Why? He asked, finally not comprehending. Min, do you have any idea how much trouble you could get in for this? In response, Mina squared her shoulders, determination written on the delicate features that weren't masked by her blindfold. For some people, she replied, her tone serious, you break the rules. For the first time since waking up that dawn, Darcon dared to have hope. He grasped her hand, and as she pulled him to his feet, a strange sensation settled in his gut, a kind of electric, giddy excitement that was both foreign and incredibly intoxicating. Darcon's heart swelled in his chest. He squeezed her hand gently. Thank you. Mina tensed up, her breath hitching, but that faint smile appeared once more, and she returned the squeeze. You're welcome. I'll need you to guide me, she murmured as they stepped out of the cellar, fumbling the door shut behind her. Gladly, Darcon replied as he hoisted the wooden bar back into place. How did you manage to get down here on your own? He asked as they stepped onto the ground floor landing. Those investigators must be watching you like hawks. Mina didn't reply, but he understood a moment later, when Warred crept out from around the corner. Darcon felt his dwarven body bristle, but before he could react past an intake of breath, Mina was nudging him gently. It's okay, she said. He's with me. Why, Celestriona, the other initiate said, whistling through his teeth as he looked Darcon up and down. They weren't lying. Balking, Darcon glanced from him to Mina in disbelief. You're kidding. He was keeping watch, Mina explained, turning in Warred's direction. He wanted to help, she insisted, no doubt sensing her friend's disbelief. He offered. Darcon was already pulling back. He's trying to trick us again, Min. Warred shrugged and shook his head. Sorry to disappoint. Stealing a glance over his shoulder, he returned his attention back to Darcon with a neutral expression. It was obvious he was there to help Mina, and aiding the initiate-turned-dwarf was an accidental byproduct. No one's come through this way as far as I've seen, but you'd better watch yourselves in the main hall. There are still a few attendants up and about. Stepping aside, he turned back to them. Be careful, both of you. And Darcon, he added, as if it pained him to say, I'm sorry about your eye. The dwarf could only stare at him, struggling to put the pieces together. You're serious? The other boy sighed. Are you going to get out of here or just keep guapping? He's right, Mina murmured, giving Darcon's hand a tug. We need to go. Thank you, Warred. She smiled in the direction of the initiate. I mean it. You're welcome. Warred fidgeted with his hand wraps, but he made no move to stop them as they stole out into the hallway. Still struggling to believe what he was hearing, Darcon cleared his throat, jerking his chin at Warred. I, guess you'd better get back to bed before someone realizes you've broken your curfew, he said stiffly, rubbing the back of his neck. Right, yeah. Warred started to retreat, only to pause and turn back to Darcon. So does everything get smaller when you change, or go screw a lambkin, Warrid? The other boy snorted, shook his head, and raised a lazy hand to them before disappearing in the direction of the dormitories, taking with him the last of the animosity Darcon held for his old adversary. He watched him for a moment longer, caught in a complex emotions he couldn't name. "Come on," Mina murmured. "We have to get moving." They began to walk, Darcon in the lead as Mina used her free hand to maintain her balance. "So is it true, then?" she whispered as they made their way up the narrow stairs. "You don't remember anything after dawn, except being killed?" "Yes," he replied. "I can remember everything up until that moment. The last memory I have is being stabbed. Seth keeps saying I need to pray to get my memories back, but He shook his head at a loss. "I don't know what to believe." He couldn't keep the desperation out of his voice, half wishing she would remove her blindfold so he could look in her eyes. If there was anyone he could trust in this God's forsaken place, it was the girl who now stood before him. "For what it's worth," Mina replied at last. Her words measured. He was telling the truth. "You explained it to the rest of us yourself, just last night." Darcon looked away, the wind out of his sails. "I was afraid you would say that." Shuffling footsteps made them freeze just outside the dry storage. Thinking quickly, Darcon pulled Mina through the doorway and into the shadows just as an attendant drifted past, looking horrid. Mina nearly lost her balance, flailing blindly, but he put a steadying hand on her arm. She leaned closer, her cheek brushing against his as her soft breath filled the silence. That same rush of nerves from before crackled in Darcon's stomach, a burst of color creeping into his face. He caught himself thanking the goddess that she couldn't see his reaction. They lingered a moment longer, anticipating more footsteps. When none came, Darcon cleared his throat. "Let's go." Although it was morning, and most of the other disciples had gone to bed, they encountered others as they emerged from the basement, forcing them to retreat into adjoining rooms at sporadic intervals. An air of unease permeated the temple. That much was obvious, even to Darcon, amnesiac though he was. Whatever else had taken place here had really stirred things up. "When did the conjurer get here?" Darcon asked, as much to ease his own nerves as to satisfy his curiosity. He was still half convinced Warrid would find some way to double-cross them. Mina flinched, almost imperceptibly beside him. "A few days ago," she replied. "Any idea why they're here?" He slowed when they passed the infirmary, making sure the coast was clear, and then urged her forward. "They couldn't have known I was coming back, could they?" Mina didn't respond for a long time. "They came for me," she said at last, "to investigate my visions." She cleared her throat. "They're planning to take me too." Darcon opened his mouth to respond, but then her hold on his hand tightened. "Are we getting close?" "Past the guest quarters," Darcon replied, pausing to peer around a corner. "Just another minute and we'll be—" But his reply died on his lips as he froze in his tracks. Farther down the main hallway, just beyond the stairs to the guest wing, was the man who had visited him earlier. He stood between them and the entrance corridor like a tall phantom, blocking their way out. Viet. Darcon drew back into the shadows, adrenaline surging through him, but Mina, still blindfolded, hadn't seen. She lurched around the corner, stopping when he pulled desperately at her wrist. But it was too late. Echoing footsteps approached. Hard in his throat, Darcon pressed his back to the wall, watching as Mina straightened up, plastering an expression of nonchalance onto her face. "Mina!" The man's smooth voice filled the air. "Investigator," she said, giving a stiff bow. "Don't," Darcon thought, as if he could will his voice into her head. "Don't talk to him." Viet didn't reply right away, and although Darcon couldn't see him, could picture the look on his face. One of cold calculation. "You're still up?" Mina ventured. Only then did the reply come, as sweet as mead and as deadly as basilisk venom, and it was over as soon as it reached their ears. "What are you doing?" Chapter 33. Mina. I'm so sorry, Darcon, Mina said. It was taking everything she had not to bury her face in her hands. Her friend didn't reply right away, shifting beside her in a futile attempt to get comfortable. He was staring, she knew, at the cellar door, which stood locked and barred between them and freedom. Just on the other side stood not one, but two temple guards, their unbothered murmurs carrying under the gap. They had arrived not long after Viet had, and although the investigator had seemingly retreated to attend to other conjuring business, the damage was done. There was no getting out this time.
Don't apologize, Darcon told her at last. We lost the moment that man asked you a question. Trust me, I've been on the receiving end of it. No way out now, though. Not with the whole temple on alert and that bastard Viet waiting for us to slip up.
Mina's flesh prickled with goosebumps at the memory of the investigator's voice, those cold fingers in her mind, and she stifled a dozen curses of her own. What else would he discover the next time he wanted information from her? And there would be a next time. Of that there was no doubt. Without the protection of the Order, they were at the mercy of the conjurer, and whatever experiments they chose to subject them to, if they didn't condemn them to Tide Island, that was. She had never felt more like a criminal than she did now. Mina pulled her legs up to her chest, fending off tears. This is all my fault. Her nerves were so shot that she almost leapt into the air when Darcon's hand came to rest on her own. Tentative, gentle, so unlike him. His touch was warm in the cool space, and she leaned into it, remembering the way he had squeezed her hand before.
None of this is your fault, Min,
he told her, and although she couldn't see his face, his sincerity was unmistakable, as was his regret.
If anything, it was mine.
That's not true, Mina protested, turning in his direction. The urge to look him in the eyes was difficult to overcome, and the longer his hand lingered on hers, the stronger it became. Guilt nipped at her heels. There was so much he didn't know.
Isn't it?
Darcon asked sadly. Don't say that, she replied. The wave of guilt was coming whether she liked it or not, and the shame that accompanied it was excruciating. Please, don't say that. She could sense his gaze on her, and the worry in his voice was what finally coaxed the first tears from her eyes.
Why? Mina, what is it?
Mina swallowed hard, her lips trembling. She had been dreading this moment ever since his return, but it was so much more painful than she had ever expected it to be. I was the one who brought the conjurer here, she whispered. There. It was out, but it brought no relief.
You.
Darcon's voice broke.
What?
Mina put a hand to her mouth, sucking in a breath. I sent a babblebird, she replied, struggling to speak through her weeping. After you left, The visions were getting worse, Darcon. They were coming true. Elder Slope died just the way I had foreseen it.
Min.
I was scared. I didn't know what to do, and after Slope died, the elders couldn't reach a decision. They were ready to break the law for me, but I didn't need protection. I needed help. She clenched her free hand so tightly that her nails dug into her palm. I thought if I could just bring the conjurer here, let them know what was going on. She turned to him. I never wanted to bring any of this down on you. Darcon didn't reply right away, but he didn't remove his hand from hers either.
You didn't,
he said at last. 2 short words, but they meant everything. Mina's breath came out in a rush. She hadn't even realized she had been holding it. You really think that?
Of course I do,
he said, shifting closer to her.
Don't put this on yourself, Min, please.
Mina lifted the edge of her leather blindfold and wiped at her cheeks with her sleeve. All my life I've done what I thought was right. Followed orders, never broke any rules, only to have it come back and bite me in the end. Bite the people I care about. She took a shuddering breath, unable to feel self-conscious, even as the confession spilled out of her. I was so worried you would be angry at me.
How could I be? Darcon asked gently. You couldn't have known I was going to come back here. In the conjuring. He shifted beside her. You called them here to help you, to heal you, and they betrayed you. This isn't your fault.
She could have collapsed in relief. Mina sighed, resting her head against the stone wall. It's funny, she mused, turning her hand over so her palm was touching his. I have a window into the future, but not even that was enough to stop any of this from happening. She shrugged her small shoulders. Maybe there's just no changing some futures. Maybe it's just fate. Darcon chuckled without mirth.
If that's what this is, I'm not sure I like it.
She smiled wistfully, relaxing in his presence the way she always had before. How simple things had been back then. They lapsed back into silence, hands together in the stillness of the cold storage. In his current form, his hand was as thick and his fingers were short. But she found that she didn't mind. He was still here, and he didn't hate her. That had to count for something. Time slowed to a crawl, but there was nothing for it. All she could do was cling to Darcon's touch, her last lifeline to the world she was leaving behind.
Your hair is growing out,
Darcon observed. Mina chuckled self-consciously and ran a hand over the dusting of dark fuzz on her scalp. I guess there's no sense in shaving it anymore. She wrinkled her nose. It's been so long. I've forgotten how I used to wear it back in the Civil Lands. There was a long pause.
I hope I get to see you when it's long,
Darcon said at last.
I remember when that trader came in last year from Ionaris with long black hair all the way down her back. I bet that would suit you.
Ionaris isn't far from 10 keeps, Mina replied. That was the fashion when I left. My mother used to wear hers the same way. So did I, when I first arrived. She didn't mention how unkempt it had been, how much it had made her look like a street urchin. Not that they had been living on the actual streets. No, they had been one step from that. But it was only a small step.
I never did see what it looked like on you, he lamented. I was, 4 weeks behind you when I joined?
You going to let your hair grow out? Realizing how that sounded, given his lack of choice in the matter, she backpedaled. Sorry, I didn't mean... Darcon grunted, and she could almost picture him looking down at his dwarven body in distaste.
It's fine, he said. I'll just have to live vicariously through your grooming choices.
His tone went serious again, and there was something more behind it when he added.
Assuming they don't separate us the moment we get to a conjurer way station.
Darcon. Mina tried to give him an encouraging smile. No matter what happens, we'll always be friends, even if they try to play us off each other. You know that, right? Darcon didn't reply right away, but his breath hitched in his throat like he was close to tears. A long moment later, his hand settled gently on either side of her face, so gentle that even the wound over her ear didn't protest. It was astonishingly intimate, especially with the blindfold obscuring her view. And only then did it dawn on her just how close they were. Close enough to embrace him. To...
Thank you for trying to get me out of here,
Darcon said, his thumb brushing over her cheek to wipe away some of the tears that had made its way past the leather.
Sorry you're in so much trouble because of me. I'd gladly let them take me and do whatever they wanted. Hells, I would volunteer. If it meant they would spare you.
Emotion welled up inside her. Mina found herself at a loss for words. Darcon cleared his throat, his tone growing pensive.
I don't remember what happened after I was stabbed,
he continued, a hint of uncharacteristic shyness creeping into his voice.
But I remember what happened before. You were always there for me, Min. No matter how bad things got, how much I messed up, I always had you. I didn't deserve you.
He hesitated, and his next words were soft.
I still don't.
In the chill of the cold storage, Mina's chest filled with heat, her stomach bubbling as if the warmth of his words was boiling away all her fear. How long had she spent wondering what it would be like to kiss him? If Darcon noticed her racing thoughts, he gave no indication, but electricity crackled between them all the same. Yearning surged through her, this time Mina listened. She had held back all her life. What was one moment of weakness in the face of what now lay before her? With unsteady hands, Mina tugged down her blindfold. He was a dwarf now, his handsome features rendered rugged and broad by his transformation. But he was still Darcon of Breakmore. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name, could see it in that fire that burned in his dark eyes. Mina leaned forward, ready to press her lips to his, and braced herself for the familiar vision of sellswords and gleaming blades. What she saw instead made her mouth drop open in horror. Darcon's death had changed, and it was coming very, very soon. Chapter 34. Darcon. Mina reeled back, falling off balance as she clapped her hands over her eyes, shaking her head frantically back and forth. No, no, no!
Min, what is it?
Darcon asked, alarmed, reaching out to her. She flinched away from his touch. I can't, she said, her whole body trembling now. I can't.
Min?
Darcon pressed.
What's wrong? What happened?
I can't, she whispered, and then fell silent.
Mina!
He took her by the shoulders, his concern for her overpowering even his fear of his own situation.
Talk to me. What's going on?
Mina just shook her head, jerking her blindfold back down over her eyes and pulling her legs up to her chest. Darcon searched her face. She was no longer facing in his direction. Her attention seemed locked on the floor in front of her as she retreated into her own mind.
Did you see something? He asked gently. One of your visions?
Of course it was. What else could it have been? But what could she have possibly seen when she looked at him? Mina didn't respond. She had begun rocking slowly back and forth, hyperventilating. He could only watch in dismay as he rubbed gentle circles on her upper arms.
Tell me what's wrong, Min,
Darcon pleaded. But she was inconsolable. Shifting closer to her, Darcon put his short arm around her shoulders. It was the only thing he could think to do. Gods, what had become of them? The conjurer came for them half an hour later. He had been expecting Viet and Haro. He was surprised when they were instead greeted by a couple of thuggish-looking men, with the distinctive golden-tanned skin of Tide Islanders, wearing uniforms proclaiming them as conjurer deputies. Darcon wasn't sure whether to be relieved or worried that the investigators hadn't come back. Mina's shivering had settled down, but what he could see of her face was still lined with fear, and she didn't speak, even as the enforcers hauled them to their feet and marched them out of the cellar. It was a relief to be out of the cold, but it didn't last long. Almost immediately they were dragged outside to the main entrance, where Seth was eyeing the temple guards with unease. He had resumed rubbing at the scarred patch of skin above his collarbone, appearing profoundly uncomfortable. A couple of packs had been heaped beside him. The deputies each shouldered one of these as they came to a stop.
Where are the others? Darcon asked, glancing back over his shoulder at the main building. The ones who interrogated me.
We're heading down without them, one of the deputies replied.
Still inside, the other elaborated, dealing with your instructors and the old woman with the walking stick.
Elder Nynx? Darcon looked from him to Mina. Her gaze remained far away, her thoughts clearly elsewhere.
Why?
Are we going to leave? The first deputy asked, or just talk about leaving? The first one grunted.
Cool it, Tanati.
I'm going to. Did you get everything?
You always ask me that. You always forget your damned rooster.
Darcon glanced Seth's way as the enforcers continued their bickering. Question must have still been on his face, because the thaumaturge sighed and gestured in the direction of the grand hall.
They're arguing about my release, he said. Your dragon said to hold me to the laws of the land. The order's claiming the right to press charges.
Even Darcon knew that wasn't likely. Hauling Seth before a magistrate would require a formal petition, and if there was one thing the order despised, it was taking its affairs beyond temple grounds. The push had to have come from Lennox, or maybe Nagus. Little did they know that the investigators were using the distraction to spirit their former students away without fanfare, or the chance to say goodbyes.
That's the least you deserve, Darcon snapped.
Maybe, was all Seth said. At last they got under way, flanked by the enforcers on either side. As they approached the gate, Darcon took a long look over his shoulder. He never thought he would be leaving the temple a second time. Yet here he was. Frustration rankled him, punctured by despair. But he reminded himself that at least he had already had a chance to say goodbye. Mina hadn't even gotten to see Lennox one last time before being dragged off. There was a moment of tension between the guards as Seth, at the front of the group, passed through the gate. Darcon had time to wonder whether they would let him leave at all, but in the end, they gave no argument. Soon enough, they were on the other side of the main wall, leaving the temple behind as they started the journey down the mountain. A carriage waited at the bottom to ferry them to Port Deep Rock. After that came Tide Island, and a fate too horrible to think about. The stairs seemed endless, even going downhill, snaking away into a dizzying sea of rocky slopes and dense foliage. Looking out at the view below made Darcon's head spin, so he focused on his footsteps, taking care not to trip and go tumbling to his death on the rocks. My next death, he corrected himself, pressing his lips into a thin line. It was almost funny. Almost. He didn't want to believe any of it. To an extent, he still didn't. But who could he trust if he couldn't trust Mina? She had only affirmed Seth's claims, which just confirmed the truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He was truly an aberration. His hands had been bound in spell-lock manacles before they left the temple, along with Mina's, no doubt as an extra precaution. Neither of their magical abilities lent themselves to true spellcasting, not in the way energy summoners like Seth could. But the bastards obviously didn't want to take any chances after they nearly escaped once already. A chance wouldn't come again, but he couldn't be angry at Mina for blurting their plans out to Viet. He, too, had been on the receiving end of the investigator's horrible power. Darcon ventured a glance up at Mina, who had pushed her blindfold back up so she could descend the stairs. One of the conjuring enforcers, Copa, he thought his name was behind her, urging her onward. She was making a point not to look at him, or anyone else, putting all her attention on her feet. It would be a long way down. He caught himself thinking back to their conversation in the cellar, before her panic had set in. She had lifted her blindfold then, too. For a moment, it had almost seemed like she was going to. Sighing, Darcon shook his head, returning his attention to the steps. Why the hells would she have kissed him? Even if she wanted to, she couldn't anymore. She said so herself. And could he blame her? He was an amnesiac in a stranger's body. She was a prophet imprisoned by her own premonitions. Whatever could have existed between them had been irreparably damaged by their circumstances. The best they could hope for now was a quick death on Tide Island. And if Seth was to be believed, that death would be final. Dusk had fallen, and as the first twinkles became visible in the lilac sky, Darcon allowed himself to take a scrutinizing look at the dimming horizon. Seth had said something about praying under an open sky. "Keep moving," barked the other deputy, Tanati. He was a brute of a man, a wall of muscle, and the push he gave Darcon nearly sent him reeling. If this new body were any less sturdy, his feet would have gone out from under him. 100 steps later, the last of the daylight was receding. Darcon tried to turn his face to the heavens a second time, but the Tide Island guard gave him another shove. Farther down on the stairs, Seth paused, glancing up at them over his shoulder. His heavy brows drew together. "What can it hurt to let the kid pray, Copa?" he asked, his eyes darting over to Darcon. "Keep your nose out of this, Dark Star," Copa snapped. "The sooner we get down, the sooner we'll be on our way." "Guess you don't have many friends in the conjury either," Darcon remarked to Seth as they resumed their course. "Can't say I'm surprised." Seth didn't respond, which was probably for the best. One of the moons, Jascord, was high overhead when they at last reached the clearing where the carriage waited, and a steady drizzle had begun to patter down, dampening their clothes and hair. It was tricky navigating the mountain roads at the best of times, but with mud mucking up the wheels, they would probably be in transit all night. Lovely. As they drew closer, the view of the wagon became clearer, and his heart sank, reinforced with iron, with bars on the windows. They had clearly been designed with prisoner transport in mind. The carriage door opened,
and a portly man tottered out of the cabin. "About damn time," he complained, shielding his face from the steadily increasing rain as he addressed the deputies. "Your bababird said to meet at noon. Does this look like noon to you?" He scrutinized the party. "Where are the others?" "They were delayed," Tanati replied. "Temple bureaucracy. Well," the driver began, "if you think I'll spend any longer waiting out in this shit, you're sorely—" "No need," Tanati interrupted. "We'll rendezvous in Deep Rock after the prisoners have been dropped off. Just give us a moment to prepare." He turned to Seth. "We'll drop you off at Nuxton, as promised. But then you're on your own. You're riding with the supplies." "Fair enough," Seth replied. Elsewhere in the foothills, thunder boomed. "More rain," the thaumaturge griped as he approached the carriage. "I guess that figures." He ventured an apologetic look in Darcon's direction, before stepping up onto the driver's box. From there, he clambered onto the roof, where the deputies were tossing their packs. He adjusted his sword, tugged up his hood, and sat back against the guard railings, casting an uneasy glance skyward. The carriage driver held open the door, and Copa nudged Darcon forward. "Go on." Darcon briefly debated fighting it, but what would be the point? He was in restraints, and outnumbered, and his life wasn't the only one on the line if he didn't behave. Mina's was too. He stole another look at his friend as Tanati lifted him into the cabin. Her head was bowed, her blindfold back in place, and the expression she wore was so grim that it made her look 10 years older. She still didn't say anything as Tanati helped her up, but when she sat down on the hard wooden bench opposite him, Darcon noticed how much she was shaking. The carriage buckled a little as the deputies climbed onto the bench behind the driver, and then they were off, rocking and swaying against the growing downpour as they wheeled down the road. With Mina stone-faced and silent, Darcon scooted over to the barred window, wondering if he could get a view of the sky from where he was. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish by praying, or if he even truly believed the claims about his memories. But he couldn't think of anything better. At least if he got them back, he might be able to recall something he could use to his advantage. Something about Seth, maybe, or about the conjury itself. Tilting his head to the right, he peered out the window, but beyond the bars he saw nothing but rocky slopes. He craned his neck, pressing his face against the metal, but to no avail. Even as they picked up speed down the road, the view was consumed by evergreens. He wouldn't get Celestriona's attention from in here. Hells! She never bothered with him before. Why start now? Letting out a long sigh, Darcon collapsed back against the cabin wall. Maybe he could at least get some sleep before this nightmare really. The thought stopped in its tracks. Mina had straightened up, her back rigid and her shoulders hunched. She was scrubbing her face against her shoulder, pulling her blindfold down in the process. "Min?" Darcon asked cautiously. Mina's eyes were still closed, but her expression had gone from one of fear to one of resignation. She was taking deep breaths, like a swimmer getting ready to dive from a high cliff. "Mina, what is it?" Finally, she opened her eyes, and no amount of wondering could have prepared him for what she said next. "You have to let me kill you." Chapter 35. Mina. She didn't give herself time to think. If she thought about it, she would lose her nerve. Mina rose from her seat and lunged for Darcon. Outside the carriage, lightning struck in the distance. Some part of her had been praying that he would say no, sparing her. That would have been enough. There would be no forgiving herself if she didn't have his permission. But his trust in her had been absolute. Not that that made what she was doing any less horrible, although she had watched herself do it just hours ago, when she'd taken off her blindfold to kiss him. It was so much worse than she could have ever predicted. Darcon began to struggle almost immediately, his need for air overriding his need to escape. One of his knees caught her in the stomach, nearly knocking the wind out of her and making her reel in pain. His survival instincts kicked in, and he began to swing blindly at her, trying to push her off, his flailing growing more frantic as she increased the pressure on his throat. But his new stature evened the playing field a great deal, and she had always been the faster fighter. Her hands hurt,
Her joints ached, and the heavy metal shackles clamped around her hands bit painfully into her skin. Darcon struggled beneath her, his face turning red and his mouth opening and closing. Before her eyes, in perfect focus, danced figures of darkness, enacting the very scene that was unfolding now. Her instincts told her to cringe away. But it was too late for that. It had been too late for that long ago. The rain slashed in through the window, soaking her head and her back, but still she persisted, doing her best to ignore everything but Darcon as he gave his life in the name of escape. "I'm sorry," she thought, praying that he could see the remorse on her face. There was a dreadful intimacy to the act, to hold someone's life in your hands and slowly push it out of them. In a horrible way, they were closer now than they had ever been before, and perhaps ever would be again. Darcon's watering eyes met hers. For a fraction of a second, Mina thought she sensed something pass between them, like it had in the cold cellar. But then he died, going still underneath her, the shadow figures disappearing without fanfare. Scrambling away from him, she willed herself not to faint, her hands flying to the blindfold, only to drop listlessly back to the floor a moment later as she realized the futility of trying to adjust the leather strap without the use of her fingers. 90 seconds. 90 seconds before he returned to her. And when he did, he would be confused. She had to keep her wits about her. This would all be over soon, one way or another. Struggling to keep her disgust in check, Mina gripped the bench for purchase and counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Mina couldn't count them quickly enough. She felt dirty in a way that could never be washed off. After weeks of haunting her mind and tormenting her sleep, death had finally made its way into her hands. Darcon's corpse lay before her, the imprints of her forearm and elbow on his throat dark and damning, even in the low light. For a moment, she was so disgusted with herself that she fought to worry about whether the enforcers had noticed the scuffle. She struggled not to look away. 11, 12, 13. He had fought her to the bitter end, even after agreeing. You could resist most things with enough willpower, but survival instincts was not one of them. The cabin around her spun a little as she tried to steady her breathing. 35, 36, 37. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but at the same time, it had been so messy, so drawn out. The life had gone out of his eyes gradually, sputtering out like a lamp burning through the last drops of its oil, before extinguishing in a puff of smoke. Gods, she wished his eyes weren't open. They stared blankly up at the ceiling, his face frozen in an expression of suffering desperation. 49, 50, 51. Was this what Dryerweep wanted from her? Was this destruction what he reveled in? I watch. I wait. When I am ready, I take. 60, 61, 62. What would he return as? Would it be enough to save them? The carriage bounced through a rut, throwing up a spray of mud and jostling her enough to make her teeth rattle. A howling wind drowned out the noises of the road, and although the carriage driver might have shouted something to the deputies, it was impossible to make out his words. Combative. That was what Lennox had said, full of rage. What if in his confusion, Darcon turned that rage on her? 83, 84, 85. Any moment now, it was out of her hands. 88, 89, 90. Mina braced herself, already holding up her hands in anticipation of a blindingly bright light or some kind of explosion. But the carriage remained dimmed. The only sounds were the sounds of the storm. Darcon was still on the floor, still a dwarf, still dead. God, tell me, what have I done? Mina lurched forward, her stomach plunging, ignoring her revulsion as she hooked her bound arms around her best friend, sticky with sweat and slick with rain in equal measure. Darcon? He was silent, his chest still. Darcon! Panic welling within her, she gave him a shake. Darcon's head slipped out from the cradle of her arms, and his body dropped lifelessly to the floor. He might as well have been a sack of flour. No. He was supposed to be waking up right now, 90 seconds, that was what Lennox said. Why wasn't it working? A horrible possibility occurred to her then. She'd let go of Darcon's body, as if he just turned red hot. What if her vision of him had changed because this was his true death, at her hands? She assumed it had been because she would be the one to kill him this time. But what if it was because this time, it really was permanent? She was responsible. No, she thought. She didn't know to whom this thought was directed, whether to herself, to Darcon, drifting on the other side of life, or to that Stygian being himself, who waited and watched from beyond the great abyss. Yeah, please. Her heart fluttering in her chest like a babblebird in flight, Lena stared down at Darcon. She had been counting yes, but perhaps in her fear, she had been counting too quickly. She clung to that hope as the carriage trundled through the relentless storm and down the pitted road. Chapter 36. Seth. The rain had soaked him through, and every bump in the road rattled the carriage on its frames, nearly throwing him off along with the enforcer's belongings. It was hardly the royal treatment, but considering what he'd been through over the past few days, he might as well have been reclining on a bed of the finest silks. Below him, the deputies were commiserating from where they sat in the driver's box. Something about finding accommodations in Deep Rock with the weather the way it was. But he couldn't hear them well over the driving rain. It wasn't his concern, at any rate. Besides, he was busy trying to purge thoughts of the kid from his mind. He needed to be looking to the future, not the past. What was done, and he'd come out of the equation more or less okay. He'd lost valuable time in his search, however, and if he was to have any hope of making it back to the nest in time for the hatching, he had to keep moving. At least, that wouldn't be much of a problem. His tattoos would see to it. As if reading his mind, his skin cried out, and the pain was enough to make him jump. They had been quiet since they'd left the power of the temple, but they never stayed quiet for long. He supposed they were reacting as they drew closer to the nest, but he had hoped for another hour or two of peace before they started their nagging. Shifting where he sat, Seth eyed the Azula Valley in the distance, and did his best to focus on his mission. But there was no shaking the sympathy he felt for the former initiates. Despite all Darcon had put him through, he was well aware of the horrors that awaited them on Tide Island. It wasn't a fate he wished on his worst enemy, and if they blamed him for setting this all in motion, then so be it. He couldn't fault them. If there was one thing Seth understood well, it was injustice. Maybe they would find a way to survive, he told himself. At least they had each other, which was more than most conjury detainees could say. The island would deactivate their new abilities the moment they came within range of its sphere of influence. But perhaps it wouldn't kill Darcon outright. Hells! He might even return to being human again, if they could just stay alive long enough. Gods, who are you kidding? He thought, sighing. They won't last a week there. He gritted his teeth, his chest tightening, and fixed his eyes on the road ahead. Another frantic wail from his tattoos finally got his attention, fresh discomfort biting through the markings and prompting him to shift uncomfortably where he sat. There was magic nearby, no doubt about it. But where? It was night. Darcon wasn't due to reincarnate again for hours. Unless... Panicked realization dawning on him, Seth glanced down at the carriage below him just in time to catch a glimpse of familiar white light blaring from the barred windows. That was when all hells broke loose. The carriage exploded out from underneath him, with sound enough to compete with the thunder. Broken beams and ragged oak splinters split the air, shooting out in all directions as he was thrown away. He went down hard, the air knocked from his lungs as the ground rushed up to meet him. Stars swam in his eyes as he tried to orient himself, and he was vaguely aware of the sounds of screams. Sluggishly, like he was moving through water, Seth got his arms beneath him and pushed himself up, gasping. The ground was slick with mud, and pain erupted in his chest as he struggled to get his breath back. More yelling filtered through the pouring rain. He was vaguely aware of the horses whinnying as they tore off into the forest, dragging the remains of their harnesses with them. The carriage driver followed suit, his screams soon lost to the storm. Seth's heart stuttered as he opened his eyes and tried to make sense of what was going on around him. The remains of the carriage lay scattered in shambles before him, one of the wheels spinning madly as it rolled away down the road, and standing in the midst of it all, Darcon, the dwarf, was gone. In the darkness, it was hard to identify what exactly the boy had become. He was big, at least 10 feet tall, gray-brown and glistening with moisture. His flesh appeared textured somehow, stretched into thick cords that followed the lines of his body, as if it were muscle with no skin to protect it. His belly bulged with each breath. Glowing silver eyes stood out in his monstrous skull. His arms were as thick as tree branches. Fingers flexed with agitation when he reached out, trying to find balance as he looked in his surroundings. The forest, the demolished carriage, the ruined spell-locked shackles at his feet. Seth scrambled away until his back struck the base of a tree. It wasn't dawn yet. This shouldn't be happening. What the hells did he turn into? "What is that thing?" Tanati yelled, echoing his thoughts. He and Copa had been flung clear of the wreckage, and were now standing on either side of the rebel, weapons drawn.
"A Crowliant,"
Copa shouted back.
"By the gods."
That got Darcon's attention, and he rounded on the enforcers, making a sound in his throat that set Seth's teeth on edge.
"Where am I?"
he demanded in a rusty, grating voice. Copa stepped forward, holding his long sword with both hands. "Don't move," he commanded. Darcon advanced on him.
"Who are you? What have you done to me?"
"Don't come any closer," Copa shouted. "By order of the Conjury, I command you to stand down."
"The Conjury?"
Darcon hunched his hulking shoulders, his confusion obvious. "Don't listen to him!" The new voice, nearly drowned out by the rain, made Darcon whirl around, scanning the night for its source.
"Mina?"
She was trapped under one of the collapsed cabin walls, her blindfold missing in the debris, panic on her face as she struggled to free her leg. She was obviously racked with pain, and she was trembling, averting her gaze as she addressed Darcon.
"Mina!"
Even Seth could sense the concern in Darcon's inhuman voice as he began plodding towards his friend.
"Are you all right? What happened?"
Tanati saw his chance, and rushed forward toward the Crowlant, brandishing his heavy steel mace. The spiked head threw droplets of water as it connected with Darcon's leg, prompting a roar of pain. To Seth's astonishment, no blood welled from the creature's sinewy flesh. Darcon whirled around, reaching for him, but he was clearly having trouble coordinating his many new limbs. And Tanati danced out of the way, landing another blow to one of his grasping hands. Darcon reeled back. A gruesome sound joined the rainy fight. It was as if dozens of oak branches were breaking under a canopy of soaked leaves, or bones snapping beneath bloody meat. For an unholy moment, Seth thought something was coming through the forest for them, but the noise was coming from Darcon's body, where the roar of pain, the textured lines of sinewy gray muscle that made up the Crowlant's frame wriggled from his torso and surged into arm-like shapes about him. Another set of hands appeared, and then another still. Within a second, Darcon's body had 6 arms. A spider in humanoid shape, each arm ending in hands made of bony knuckles and gray skin. All the while, Seth could only watch, drawing his sword, but in preparation for what, he didn't know. He struggled to find his breath, but each inhale hurt, and his torso was on fire. He'd broken a rib, no doubt, probably more than one. Copa gave Darcon a wide berth, his sword raised and his eyes blazing as he closed in on Mina, who was trying to scramble free of the wreckage, her hands still locked onto the oyster-shaped manacles, picking off the easier target first, of course. "Look out!" Seth yelled, unsure why, but it didn't matter. Mina couldn't hear him over the gale, anyway. At least, she pulled herself out from the destroyed carriage. But Copa was already charging her. Seth wobbled up to his feet and started forward, his lungs on fire and his sword in hand. But there was no hope of reaching them in time. Copa closed on the petite girl, likely prepared to cut her down where she stood. But Mina was quick. She leapt back, clearly dismayed by what she was seeing. She gritted her teeth, keeping her eyes open, and on the threat. Faying left, she dodged the incoming blow and lashed out with her leg, sending him stumbling just in time to drive her knee into his nose at full force. Blood sprayed. Copa cried out, and his grip on the sword loosened. Mina kicked it free of his hand, sending it flying off to the left. Copa swore, starting after it. But that was when Darcon arrived, sweeping the man aside with a lazy brush of his tree-trunk-sized leg. The Tide Islander cried out in pain moments later as he sat up,
his sword arm bent at an unnatural angle. "Copa!" Tanati yelled, glancing in his partner's direction before rounding on Darcon. "I'll kill ye, you bastard!" Darcon had already closed the distance between them, his many arms still awkward in their movements as they swept Tanati up in a terrible grip. One set holding the man by the hips, another by the chest, and the last around the Tide-Islander's arms. He seemed to be using his new appendages on instinct now, and their power was obvious as the deputy's feet left the ground in one smooth moment. Tanati's mace fell uselessly to the mud at Darcon's feet, sending water splashing up against Seth's legs. The Tide-Islander thrashed madly, curses pouring from his lips as he struck the beast with his fist again, and again, to no avail. Darcon raised the man to his face, his eyes like two beacons as he scrutinized him for a moment. Then he roared again, enraged. "Conjuring bastards!" he boomed. "What did you do to us?" Seth watched the scene with wide eyes. The boy hadn't kicked Copa hard enough to kill him. The man was still screaming in agony somewhere in the stormy night. But Darcon was looking at Tanati the way a wolf looked at a cornered rabbit. It was like the fight with the sellswords all over again. He remembered it well, the way Darcon had crushed through them like they were nothing more than insects. But that wasn't what gave him pause now. It was what Darcon had said in the aftermath. "Now I've finally done something that I can't take back." The thaumaturge sucked in a whooping breath, still wheezing as he clutched his bruised ribcage, searching for a voice he'd lost. It wouldn't absolve him of his guilt, but it might be a step in the right direction. Darcon's grip on the still struggling Tanati tightened, and the man shrieked in pain as something cracked. Darcon was crushing him. Another few seconds, and he would be dead. Seth's nerves screamed, his breath rattling, but in those few brief moments, for the first time since he could remember, his markings were silent. "Darcon!" he shouted, loudly enough to surprise himself, loudly enough to pierce through the driving rain. For a second, he thought the monster hadn't heard him. But then Darcon turned his pale gaze on the man standing far below him. Recognition dawned on his hideous face, alongside renewed anger. Whether consciously or not, he squeezed Tanati harder, prompting the man to cry out in agony. "You," Darcon growled. "I got you stabbed," Seth yelled hoarsely, nodding, finishing the boy's oft-repeated phrase for him. "It's my fault, all of it." Darcon's lips pulled back from his teeth as black as obsidian and as sharp as razors. "This was all your doing." Seth swallowed. "Yes," he replied. "Mine, not his." He gestured weakly up at the Tide-Islander, whose face was racked with pain as he struggled uselessly against the power of the boy's multiple arms. "Don't do it, Darcon. You'll regret it if you do." Darcon gave another ear-splitting roar, shaking Tanati with enough force to make his head flop back and forth. "You're lying!" "He's telling the truth." Mina's voice got through to him once again, and Darcon turned slowly to look at her, as if he'd forgotten she was there. She was hunched over, her bound wrist raised to protect her face in case Copa attacked again. But there was no uncertainty in her words. "Mina." Darcon shook his head in disbelief. "What are you saying? What is he saying?" "It's not worth it," Mina replied, straightening up. "Believe me. Or better yet, believe her." She gestured upwards, at the cloud-shrouded sky above them. "What are you talking about?" Darcon asked, pleading now. "Mina, what's going on? What has happened to me?" "Celestriona has the answers," Seth interjected. "But you need to pray to her. Then you'll understand." "Shut up," Darcon growled, his luminescent eyes darting from him to Mina. The conflict in them was unmistakable, and another metallic rumble coming from his throat. But ultimately, he leveled his gaze at Mina. She gave him a single, slow nod. He turned his face to the sky, still clutching Tanati in those enormous sets of hands, and closed his eyes. A moment passed, and then another, and there it was. The brief, subtle luminescence that lit up the boy's massive form, and the pinprick in the clouds from which there emanated the same haunting pale light. When he finally opened his eyes again, it wasn't Seth who Darcon turned to, but Mina. "Did it," he said. "You went through with it. You killed me." The girl took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry, Darcon. I'm so sorry. It was the only thing I could do." "I know, Mina," Darcon told her gently. as gently as his ungodly voice would allow. Then he returned his attention to Tanati, who had given up his floundering and was now staring at Darcon with wide, frightened eyes. A low growl issued from the monk, but the fire in his expression had dissipated. Slowly, almost gingerly, he lowered the rain-drenched man back to the ground, where he swayed on unsteady legs, looking faint. "Leave," Darcon commanded. "Take your partner and go." Tanati remained where he was, casting an uncertain look in Copa's direction. His partner was still watching Mina, his eyes flitting between her and his lost blade. "Go!" Darcon shouted again, loudly enough to scare the birds that had taken shelter from the storm in the nearby trees. The Tide Islander didn't need to be told a third time. Not bothering to reach for his mace, he approached his injured colleague, gave him a hand up, and didn't look back. A minute later, the Conjury deputies were shambling back up the path, heading in the direction of the temple and their supervisors. And just like that, they were alone. Seth, Mina, and Darcon, each eyeing the others in the sudden silence of the clearing. The rainstorm was pulling away from them, surrendering to the heaven above, as if the boy's call to his goddess had reopened the sky. As the mammoth-sized former initiate took in a steadying breath, his muscles constricted along the sets of his new arms. With the sound of vines dragged through wet tree branches, they returned to his torso and sides, nestling back into him until Seth could not see where they had even come from to start. Darcon turned to Mina first, and she flinched as he leaned down, two of his massive hands settling on her shackles, and pulling them apart as easily as if they were wet parchment. The mangled metal clattered to the ground, and she rolled her wrists for a moment before turning to Seth. He could have sworn that she balked again when her uncovered eyes settled on him. But a split second later, her stoicism had returned, and she settled into a practiced fighting stance. Darcon followed suit, rounded on him, ready to fight. He didn't say a word, however, and he made no movement to advance, even as his gaze dropped to Seth's sword. It felt to the thaumaturge like the boy was sizing him up, his mind turning over a question that Seth himself wasn't privy to. "You stopped me from killing him." Darcon's silver eyes were blazing, and although he regained his memories, there still seemed to be confusion in them. "Why?" Seth didn't reply, instead straightening up and sheathing his sword. His tattoos had resumed their pulsating call, urging him ever onward in pursuit of his next item. He nodded in the direction of the valley. "The road will be crawling with Conjury agents once those two raise the alarm. Stick to the trees. If you follow the Azula down past Benchero Lake, you should be able to avoid most of them and reconnect with the main highway." Darcon blinked once, still sizing him up, but his many arms now hung limply at his sides in a strained tangle of elbows and forearms. That look had settled over him. Mina spoke up instead. "Aren't you going to stop us?" Seth raised his eyebrows. "Why?" "You're a member of the Conjury, aren't you?" Seth looked over at the demolished carriage. "It's complicated," he said after a long moment. "You're not worried we're going to try to stop you?" Darcon asked, crossing two of his arms. Seth sighed and shook his head. "Look, I never meant for you to get hurt, either of you." He gestured hopelessly at the scars and tattoos extending toward his throat. "If I could have stopped this all from happening, I would have. I've mucked up the situation enough for the three of us as it is. If you want to try to stop me—" He shrugged his shoulders, regretting it instantly as his bruised, at least he hoped they were bruised and not broken, ribs complained. "I can't say I'd blame you. Gods know that's not a fight I would win. Otherwise, all I can say is I'm sorry. Truly." Darcon crossed his top arms, but he made no move towards Seth. Was it just him, or had Darcon's expression softened ever so slightly? "You'll forgive us if we don't shake your hand," Darcon said at last. "Or turn our backs on you," Mina added. Seth could only nod. "Fair enough. Goodbye, and good luck." Half wondering whether they would change their minds, he began to trudge downhill, raindrops falling sporadically around him, his footsteps squelching in the mud as his tattoos tugged him relentlessly forward. So much for hitching a ride. Still, he reminded himself, at least he wasn't tied up at this time. Thank the gods for small favors. Seth was halfway to the next bend, in the road when he paused, turned around. "By the way," he called, looking first at Mina, and then at Darcon, "watch out for the dragonblight coming down from the foothills. There's a nest nearby." Mina stiffened almost imperceptibly, but she managed a curt nod. "Noted," Darcon replied. "Thank you." The words were brisk and weary, but they carried the weight of an understanding that was likely to forever remain unspoken. Seth stood there, watching the former disciples for another moment. They were going to be okay, he decided. He wasn't sure why he thought so, but he did. Calling in intuition. Turning back around, Seth started down the road once more. And this time, he didn't look back. He had an amethyst egg to hunt. Epilogue. Darcon. Despite the late hour, the fat tabby inn was packed nearly to bursting. All around them, patrons jostled each other for the barkeep's attention, sloshing their drinks and ogling the harried-looking serving wench. Barking laughter drowned out the minstrel's medallion, rendering him no more than an aesthetic backdrop, and the aromas of overcooked mutton and stale ale filled the air. How many people were crammed into this dining room? 20? 50? Darcon had lost his frame of reference. After years spent only ever seeing the other students on the monastery, the mass of bodies felt wrong, somehow borderline unnatural. Across the table from him, Mina was quietly nursing her wine, unperturbed. Perhaps the problem wasn't the size of the crowd. Perhaps it was today's body. His diminutive stature made everything and everyone seem oppressively large, as if he were a lambkin in a room full of giants. Then again, compared to the wretched shell that now held him, it would have gladly taken a lambkin's body this morning. Still, there were worse places to be a goblin. In a small town, his appearance would likely have gotten them run off for fear of pestilence. Fanemoor, however, was a major metropolis. They called it the mouth of the West, for good reason. It could have been a state in itself. Between the city watchmen, the streetwalkers prowling the back alleys, and black market fences, was full of life even during the late hours. Strange how new it all felt to him, even after being away from the temple for so long. "It's late," Mina announced, setting aside her empty goblet, stifling a yawn as if to prove her point. "We should get some rest. We have an early start tomorrow." What a miserable thought that was. With summer in full swing, and the daylight hours stretching even further, he would be lucky to have his memories for 9 hours, before sunrays stole them from him again. "You think we'll be able to rest with all this?" Darcon gestured, around at the commotion of the dining room. She laughed an eerie sound that never failed to make his heart trip over itself. "You say that, but you're always the first one asleep." Darcon couldn't help a chuckle of his own. "I'll take your word for it." He tossed a copper onto the table. "I could stand a turn in, I suppose. I've got some writing to do." "Writing?" Mina asked, turning to look at him as she got up. Darcon rummaged in his satchel for a moment, before producing a leather-bound book, the parchment within blank and ready to fill. "You mentioned this morning after you—" He cleared his throat. "Talked me down. I bought it while you were in the record-keeper's office." Mina crossed her arms. "So that's where all the money went." "It was your idea," Darcon retorted, laughing. "Besides, I was the one doing the begging this time." "You have a point there." Mina smiled, picking up her cane with one hand and taking his hand with the other, allowing him to lead her through the crowd. She had regained much of her nimbleness in the preceding months, was handy with a cane, but she still interlaced her fingers with his whenever there were people around. Darcon had witnessed the way she thrashed in bed at night, or the way she had sometimes broke out in a cold sweat, even on the hottest days. What she had seen in the grand hall that day and at the temple remained with her still. The other reason she held his hand was far simpler, and far lovelier. It drifted, unspoken, between them. On the nights when whatever monstrous form he had taken was too much for him, Celestriona's voice was hard to hear. It was what kept him going. What kept them both going. They wove out of the dining room, making it for the narrow stairway that led to the room she had rented for them, because no one would have willingly accepted a goblin's coin. Even now, they drew quite a few stares from the surrounding patrons,
who were no doubt wondering why a human woman would be holding the hand of a creature so grotesque. They tended to assume he was a slave, serving as her eyes. They had learned to lean into the produce early on, having stick together, thanks of course to Mina's incredible skill with thread and needle, given her family occupation, a varying array of servants' clothing that he could mix and match depending on his size and appendages. It was always a risk, spending the night indoors, not knowing what form he would take come dawn. If they accidentally slept past sunrise, it became too large to get through the doorway, as it happened a few weeks ago in Meadowlot. They would have to wreck the building to free him. There was no doubt that the conjurer still had its ear to the ground in the aftermath of their escape. When they reached the door, they turned around, still hand in hand, to face the dining room. Darcon glanced at Mina, whose mirth had evaporated. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She gave a quick nod. "Are you sure?" he pressed, brows pulling together. "You know, you don't have to." "It's fine," Mina replied, swallowing. "I'm fine. I'll be fine." Steeling herself for another moment, she took a steadying breath before hooking a finger under her blindfold and lifting it up. It was routine at this point, but it still pained him every time to watch her put herself through this. Her reaction wasn't as visceral as it had been in the beginning. She tightened her hold on his hand all the same, her mahogany eyes widening as she saw things no mortal should ever see. He hoped that one day the torment would finally stop, and she would be able to abandon the blindfold once and for all. Darcon rubbed his thumb over her calloused knuckles. A few moments later, Mina let out a long breath and lowered the blindfold, her shoulders slumping in relief. "Nothing," she said, anticipating his question. "No deaths tonight." "Thanks, Celestriona, for small favors," Darcon muttered. The last thing they needed was to get caught up in a barroom scrap or freak fire. They had been lucky so far. But if there was one thing Darcon of Breakmore had learned, it was that nothing was guaranteed. "And my death?" he asked, bracing himself like he always did. Mina gave him a small smile and shook her head. "Still normal. Stabbed in the back by bandits. You'll die come dawn, but it won't be by someone else's hand. Come on, let's get out of here." The room wasn't anything special, with nothing but a table and 2 beds, but it had been ages since they'd last slept under a real roof. To Darcon, it might as well have been the finest palace. Mina dropped onto one of the threadbare mattresses, taking a moment to wrestle her shoes off before clambering under the covers. It would have been easier to share a bed, but they had yet to be intimate, yet to kiss, even, although he had returned to a human 6 times so far, each time with the same physical features he had been born with. There had been other repeats, too. He had been a swamper elf a few times, but the repeat bodies were always consistent, with the exception of his dwarven form. That one had looked different the second time around, according to Mina, but he had yet to figure out what that meant. "How bad was it tonight?" he ventured as he tugged off his own shoes. "The vision, I mean." Mina's eyes darkened. "The same. Everyone who doesn't die of other causes in the next few years will be killed by dragons. Slaughtered. Either that, or they'll starve to death." Darcon pressed his lips together, flooded as always with a sense of dread. "I'm sorry," he said, wishing there was something more he could do. Mina could only shrug her shoulders, resigned. "It is what it is." Clearing his throat, Darcon drifted to her bedside, taking her hand in his once more. "Get some sleep," he advised. "You too," Mina replied, giving him a soft smile before turning over and pressing her face onto the pillow. She said no prayer to Celestriona, Darcon noted. Pausing long enough to dim the lamp, Darcon crossed to the table, climbed up onto the chair, rolling his aching shoulders. They had spent the past hours bent over a map of the Uthran Valid, planning a trip that could very well turn out to be a fool's errand. But they had to try. Bragon had disappeared from old Lady Hinda's clearing by the time they returned, along with the witch herself, leaving nothing behind but a pile of rubble. He was still out there somewhere. Darcon knew this with a certainty he could not explain. They wouldn't rest until they found him. They couldn't. It was long past time to pick up the pieces of their fragmented lives. Darcon set the journal on the table in front of him, and flipped it open, puzzling over what to write. It needed to be clear, concise, but with enough detail to make it credible, without leaving out anything important. He supposed he could make it a daily ritual, but he would need to establish the basics first. It felt a bit like a waste of time, but Mina herself had said she was growing weary of explaining the situation to him every morning. He couldn't blame her. Despite the number of times he had already gone through it, the change still remained dangerous and unpredictable. All the worse, if he came back as something big and bloodthirsty. No. He would have to make it work, write something that would fill in the blank spots, and most importantly, convince him to pray to his goddess every night. Setting out the fresh quill and ink bottle he'd purchased, Darcon frowned down at the blank pages. For a moment longer, he began to write. I know what you're feeling right now. You're scared, confused, and angry. The last thing you remember is the dagger. You and Brigon were being attacked by sellswords by the inn near the temple. You remember the cold too, right? The darkness that sticks to you like oil. Now you're wondering where you are. What's happened to you? You're wondering where Brigon is and why Mina is here trying to explain these things to you. I'm writing this to make sure you know the truth. It was a painstaking process, but he gave it his full attention, beginning with the story of his death, and moving chronologically, Brigon's ritual, tracking Seth and marching him all the way back to the temple, killing the mercenary on the road when he was a hill ogre, as painful as the memory still was, his conversation with Lumiere being cast out, their escape. He did his best to hit all the key moments, prepping in details whenever he could, all in an attempt to ease the future panic of his amnesiac mind. As of writing this, it's been 3 months since you and Mina escaped the investigators. He went on. It was coming more easily now, his pen flying as flecks of ink splattered onto the page in a constellation of their own. Brigon is still missing. You've been searching for him ever since. The conjury's still on your back. Not just the investigators either. They were ready to banish you and Mina to Tide Island. Make no mistake. If they find you again, they will. He glanced over his shoulder at Mina, who was sleeping quietly, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. By night, you travel with the woman you love. She bears witness to your deaths, the old and the new. You can never stay in one place for too long. It doesn't matter, as long as she's by your side. She knows the full story, but there's no sense in making her retell it every day. That's why she suggested that you write this. I know you will probably still have questions. You need to trust that Mina can answer them. Things are different now, for you. They probably always will be. But if you only believe one thing that I write here, believe this. Darcon paused, his quill poised over the paper for a moment as he debated his next words. Outside the window, a smattering of thunderheads obscured his view of the stars. But they had not denied him his prayers just after sunset. And something happened, as if brought on by magic, or the hand of an invisible deity. The moon breakcord slipped out from behind the massive clouds, its pale light battling the illumination of the city below. Serene, watchful, and although he couldn't see them now, he knew that somewhere beyond the view, the stars twinkled. Before long, they would vanish, rendered invisible as the moon descended past the horizon, and dawn rose. They were still there, and they would always return come nightfall. There was something reassuring in that. Darcon thought for a moment longer, before he put the quill to paper once more. You have become Darcon of Dawns, he wrote. And every sunrise, you are reborn. Thank you for reading Unbound Life. Marie and I appreciate you giving us a chance to tell this story. You can help us write full-time and devote more time to telling these tales from Heavenfall by leaving a review. Join our newsletter for updates on our new books set in this mystical world and receive additional stories that are not available anywhere else. Find the next book in the cast-off series here, Mina of Misfortunes.